Welcome to Silicon Bites. Well, the episode that I had written for today and indeed yesterday, I had to chuck those in the bin because all has been overtaken by the extraordinary car crash press session in the White House. Today's episode, wretched hive of scum and villainy. The ambush of Zelensky in the Oval Office. After watching the car crash presser in the Oval Office, it's easier to think that this was a disaster for Zelensky and personally for Ukraine and not for Trump. But this may not be the case. That's the theme we'll be unpacking in this episode, as well as looking at some of the initial comments and reactions from experts across social media. Before we do, it's worth remembering that when you combine last night's tirade of abuse by Trump and co. of Zelensky and Ukraine with what's happening yesterday, it's potentially extremely distressing and re-traumatizing for Ukrainians. The treatment of that country and its people by the US administration amounts to victim blaming and abuse. We must remember, as Zelensky said, this is not a game of cards, but a terrifying reality where many Ukrainians are at daily risk of being killed, and all will know friends and family who are serving or who are lost in combat, missing, tortured, raped, and abducted. To see their leader treated in this way, to see a conscious effort to belittle and humiliate him, must be extremely distressing for many Ukrainians. Things are moving fast, and after this episode has been recorded, much could still change. So we will continue to do analysis and reporting of what is happening, and of course, try to understand whether there is a bigger story behind the chaos that we saw yesterday. But it seems that in a move of extraordinary petulance, Trump is threatening to pause all aid to Ukraine, including assistance to rebuild its shattered energy grid. Such a reaction to what happened yesterday would inevitably lead to deaths, many, many avoidable deaths. It would be a murderous set of decisions. Let's be clear on that. But if Trump is prepared to burn bridges after one confrontation, albeit quite an extraordinary one, it does suggest that his turnaround in support of Ukraine had extremely shallow roots. And indeed, as the press event descended into vitriolic chaos, Trump and Vance instantly reverted to spewing Kremlin talking points, weaponized narratives that are utterly false, demeaning, and triggering for any Ukrainian who's facing Russian violence. Weaponized narratives that are utterly false, demeaning, and triggering for any Ukrainian who is facing Russian violence on a daily basis. Having said that, and I will be trying to break down further what seemed to be a premeditated ambush by Vance, we must examine Zelensky's performance before we get into that. Most of the comments online are sympathetic to his position and the fact he was stuck between a rock and a hard place. Of course, in an ideal world, due consideration would be given to his status as a war leader and the immense stress he is under. But this is not a normal situation. He willingly pushed himself into the bear pit. He willingly pushed himself into the bear pit of the Oval Office and the baying mob of reporters, some sympathetic to Ukraine and some clearly not. This was a predictable scenario and one which should have been prepared for, prepared in the meticulous way in which Zelensky clearly prepared for the inane and shallow questions asked by Lex Friedman in his marathon interview with Zelensky. In that session, Zelensky answered in a very thoughtful, persuasive, and highly strategic manner. Calm but passionate. This was not the Zelensky that we saw yesterday. He was easily triggered. He seemed to be nervous and tired right from the start. Yes, he was ambushed by Vance, who was playing to the MAGA crowd, trying to create a show for the gallery. But Zelensky responded with petulance, impatience, desperation even. His answers were factual, yes, and values-based, born of personal experience and real knowledge of the situation. But having a heated debate in the glare of the world's press was not the point of yesterday's visit. Getting a minerals deal signed was as a stepping stone to further negotiations around security assistance. That was the purpose of the meeting. And it was just one of a series of meetings and stages in what is bound to be a long process. And unfortunately, Zelensky blew this opportunity out of the water. Now, in future episodes, in the next episode, we'll examine perhaps some of the things going on behind the scenes that led to this. And we will examine as well why Trump's peace may not really amount to peace at all, but surrender on Russian terms. Well, that's another topic, as I say, that we're going to cover in the next episode. Zelensky is a consummate performer. He's verbally agile, even in what is his third language, English. On a good day, and with adequate preparation, he could have perhaps answered with strength and grace. But in the bear pit of the Oval Office, he seemed easily provoked and thrown off balance. It's possible that the situation was not anticipated, though a good crisis communications manager would have absolutely seen these potential traps coming. It's also possible the attacks of the previous week put him on edge, or some additional pressure was applied behind the scenes that we are not aware of. It's also possible that Zelensky is simply too painfully aware that the minerals deal proposed by Trump contained no security guarantees, no backstop to allow Europeans to commit troops on the ground. He is all too painfully aware that this process was taking the same course as all the other past failures and represented a serious departure from the concept of peace through strength, which General Kellogg talks about. The delusion and hypocrisy, naivety and immorality of the proposed process may simply have become too much for him. I'm convinced that an extraordinary communicator, actor, and highly empathetic leader like Zelensky could, with proper preparation, have handled the encounter with dignity and strength, with more controlled and concise answers, and without appearing so defensive. But in that moment of stress, he lost control, quite possibly because all the potential traps, curveballs, and hand grenade questions that such an event was likely to throw up had not been planned out. Answers practiced, role-played, war-gamed even by Zelensky and his team. As Vlad Vexler has pointed out, Trump displays extreme narcissistic behavior and will only show respect or deference to those he thinks to be equally or more powerful than him, or more wealthy, of course. Amounts to the same thing in his world. Clearly, he does not see Zelensky, or by extension, Ukraine, as strong. This is due not just to Russian propaganda, but probably to a wide-held and false perception in the circles that he mixes in. The leadership qualities we see in Zelensky, that we recognize in him, are not ones that Trump recognizes or values. Trump is spectacularly dismissive of Zelensky. At some point, that was always going to blow up. It just so happened that yesterday was the day. Vance escalated the situation in a premeditated way, whether simply to appear to the MAGA base, whether simply to appeal to the MAGA base to make Zelensky look wrong so he could appear right, or for other premeditated and deeper reasons. It is entirely possible that he has set himself a mission to blow up this process and clear the way for the US to deal more openly with Russia and without having to virtue signal support for Ukraine. Whether for self-interest or as an asset of Russia, we can only speculate on the potential reasons why. But Vance has been consistent in his disdain and loathing for Ukraine throughout the presidential election process and even before. We should not be surprised at his approach yesterday. Unfortunately, nor should Zelensky have been surprised by it either, especially after Vance tried unsuccessfully to torpedo the sessions earlier this week between Trump and Macron and Trump and Starmer. What we witnessed was an extraordinary act of bullying in the Oval Office. Vance was completely in control when he escalated the situation. This is the chaos we have seen in the US domestic politics, with the violence being inflicted against good governance wrought by Doge. Now, this is writ large on the geopolitical stage as well. Democratic decline causing geopolitical decline, as Vlad Vexler proposes. The implications of yesterday ripple out further than just a suspended minerals deal. We could see a decisive shift of the US towards alliance with Russia and an intensification of hostility towards the EU. This, of course, aligns with the long term goals of the Kremlin: erode international institutions and alliances, especially those that get in the way of Russian expansion and its global objectives to project power and extract resources. Another casualty could be Article 5 and the collective defence of Europe from predatory authoritarian regimes. On many levels, the time has come to create smaller, more focused and agile alliances that deter with actions, not words, and rhetoric. Everything may now rest on European resolve at a time of pressure unprecedented in the post-war period. Political pressure, economic and psychological pressures are building. It will be surprising relief if Europe rises to the occasion and helps Ukraine to save itself and helps Ukraine to save Europe from Russian tyranny. Here are some quotes and thoughts from experts across social media that broadly fit with my interpretation of what's going on. Now, more of this in the next episode about the strangely premeditated attack on Zelensky in the Oval Office. Anna from Ukraine says, watching Trump and Vance humiliate Zelensky was disgusting. Zelensky invited them to see Ukraine, but they'd rather spread Russian lies. This was staged. Trump's peace plan failed because Putin doesn't negotiate. He dictates. Now Trump blames Zelensky to save face. There are, to add to that, rumours that the US has already cut off some intelligence data used by Ukraine in their war effort, as well as a cessation of tracking Russian cyber threats by CISA, with new protocols on that agency's work specifically not mentioning Russia as a malicious target for cybercrime and cyber hacks, etc. This is, of course, absurd because Russia is one of the number one malicious actors in that world. This quote from an anonymous expert, but one who I certainly regard very highly. This one from an anonymous expert, but one whom I regard very highly. He says, vice presidents never speak in the Oval Office, let alone have the free rein to interject in the way that Vance did today, suggesting there is an orchestrated character to the combined attack we saw on Zelensky, as if the Trump administration needed an excuse to jump into bed with Russia and complete a process that had already begun. Ron Filipowski says Trump and Vance needed to create an incident to provide a justification for their pre-planned abandonment of Ukraine now, then separation from NATO in the near future. That's what all this was about, and that was always the way a second Trump term was going to go. Phillips P. O'Brien writes, if you think this was a disagreement about the mineral deal, you have no idea what just happened. Trump was putting pressure on Zelensky to make major concessions, probably agree to Putin's demands, and get no security for Ukraine in return, and Zelensky had the courage to say no. Well, this is the theme that we're going to pick up on in the next episode, which is coming again today or tomorrow. Gary Kasparov writes, if Zelensky wanted to surrender to Putin, he would have gone to Moscow, not Washington. And here's one with a trigger warning. This one comes with a trigger warning. This is from Lindsey Graham. I don't know if we can ever do business with Zelensky again. Tell me, this isn't Graham talking now, this is me. Tell me if you find an example of a politician that is more of a spineless worm than Graham, ready to betray his values, his country, his family, anything to maintain proximity to power, maintain his status and privilege. Lindsey Graham has met all the actors in this. He's been to Ukraine multiple times, but he's ready to throw that over in a moment in order to suck up to his dear leader. Robert Horvath writes, "Despicable. If you are leader of a democracy, you do not demand that the elected leader of a people enduring a genocidal war ignores your lies. You do not repeat the invader's propaganda. You do not shout him down in public." Jay in Kiev writes, "Helping Putin genocide Ukraine is now the glue that holds the White House together." And here is Trump's own statement after the car crash press session. He doesn't have to stand there and say Putin this and Putin that, all negative things. He's got to say, "I want to make peace. I don't want to fight any longer." Well, in this phrase, the psychotic orange baby reveals his real thinking on the matter. For him, it's clear that Ukraine needs to surrender to what he perceives to be the stronger power, Russia. Except Putin has killed hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians, presided over an army that has looted, raped, and tortured its way across Ukraine. What nice words do you expect the victims to have to say about the aggressor, Trump? And the original truth, the first major meme of this war, is entirely ignored and misunderstood by Trump. If Russia stops fighting, there will be no more war. But if Ukraine stops fighting, there will be no more Ukraine. And Trump has not once pointed the finger of blame towards Putin, and not once asked Russia to stop fighting and withdraw its troops from Ukraine. Super Taxki writes, "Republicans are already saying Zelensky should resign. I knew they would. First, they forced him to say he'd leave office for the sake of peace. That was a few weeks ago. Then there is premeditated display in the Oval Office, and all this so that Putin can install a puppet ruler in Ukraine. The reality is that the US government is actively working for the Kremlin." Oz Katerji, who's been on the channel, writes, "If I was a stockbroker, I'd be buying the shit out of Rheinmetall stocks right now." David Frum says, "No, the meeting did not go badly for Ukraine. It exposed in the most undeniable, unequivocal way possible the pro-Putin commitments of the president and the vice president. This was information Americans and allies needed to have clearly stated before them." Rick Wilson writes, "Russian state media TASS was in the Oval Office meeting. AP and Reuters were not. Get it yet?" Now, this is a comment I want to add my own thoughts to as well. It was later stated that it was accidental that a Russian correspondent made it into the press pool. It's scarcely credible that that's accidental. It's scarcely credible that that could just sort of be a slip and happen just like that. It suggests, it gives weight to the idea that this was premeditated, because you invite Russian press in there. Of course, they're going to be able to see the video anyway. They don't have to be present in the room to understand what went on. But gifting them a ringside seat to this spectacle, well, that is indicative of some kind of conclusion. Well, that is indicative of some kind of collusion, I'm afraid, and we will try to get more information on that story in the subsequent episode. Gabrielis Landsbergis says, "While we discuss this unreality show, Ukrainians are in trenches defending our continent. Russia's 190 billion euros are sitting in our banks untouched. Our best weapons are in storage far from the front line, and our pilots aren't closing any skies. This is not a drill, people." Michael Weiss writes, and this is the final quote here, from one of Ukraine's most prominent news outlets, the Kiev Independent. They say it's time to say it plainly. America's leadership switched sides in the war. The American people have not, and they should speak up. And as we get into the final part of this episode, I wanted to quote back a short video that Timothy Snyder has made on his Substack. Now, normally he writes long and extremely engaging articles. This is the first short video engagement he's made, and it is definitely worth watching. So we'll put a link to that in the description of the video. Timothy Snyder lists what he calls five fundamental errors committed by the President and Vice President of the United States at the event, and they are not necessarily the ones you might expect. Firstly, he says the failure to be hospitable, especially to a foreign dignitary who is coming from a place of war and trauma, heroism and resilience. Yelling and interrupting a guest you invited into your home is not hospitable or generous or gracious. It reveals the basest of nature's lack of culture and manners, and ultimately basic humanity. The second failure he lists is one of decency. Zelensky represents a country at war and is mandated by his people to be their representative. In the face of resistance to Russian atrocities and barbarism, he deserves respect for leading his people to resist. Snyder puts this very eloquently. To yell at them that they're wrong when they've experienced things that you have not, when they've seen things that you have not, when they've faced choices that you haven't had to face, well, that's a failure of decency. The third failure he lists is one of democracy. Zelensky is from a democratic country. He was elected with a big majority, 73%, far higher than Trump's own election result. And his country expects him to represent them with strength, not kowtow to Trump in the way that Putin demands obedience. Ukrainians will not tolerate their leader to simply submit to abuse, ridicule, and accept gross untruths being hurled in his face, literal propaganda with their origins in Moscow. Zelensky would not last 5 minutes if he succumbed to bullies and bullying tactics or sacrificed his dignity for momentary gain or to feed the monumental ego of Donald J. Trump. Strategy is the fourth failure, and the fifth failure is independence, says Snyder. He explains in that inhospitable, indecent, undemocratic, unstrategic fracas that took place in the Oval Office, there was a complete lack of independence on the American side. What he means by this is that once they lost their feigned reasonableness, Trump and Vance spewed out a liturgy of Russian talking points, outright lies and misinformation, all of which can trace their origins back to the Kremlin lie machine. Snyder makes some other interesting points. It's worth watching this episode. Broadly, most Americans understand that Russia invaded Ukraine. They understand that the war is Putin's responsibility. Ultimately, that is, that if peace is to prevail, it could happen tomorrow if Putin simply withdrew his forces. But you will not hear the same accusations, malice, and invective leveled at Putin by Trump or Vance that they threw at Zelensky yesterday. All the concessions, all the pressure to capitulate to a bad peace are forced onto the Ukrainian side. And again, we will unpack that more in the next episode. What we clearly witnessed yesterday are the beginnings of an American alliance with Russia. In fact, with statements made over the last few weeks, the outlines of such a direction have been coming clearer and clearer. And we must ask ourselves some tough yet logical questions now. Siding with Russia makes no strategic or economic sense. Why should the US abandon its traditional alliances when Canada's economy alone is larger than Russia's? Expand that scenario to Europe, and the economic power of European countries is at least 15 times larger than Russia. The export opportunities for the US, much, much greater. And it's to Europe that America sells its weapons, not Russia, not China. They will never buy American weapons and exports. An industry that sustains millions of jobs in the US. Trump's behavior risks trashing confidence in the US as a weapons supplier. This might have been the greatest car crash press conference in the history of any democratic country, but it may also turn out to be a colossal geopolitical failure and a decisive point where the world pivoted into a new age, a new world order. It could also mark the moment where Ukraine and Europe gave up the delusion of this incarnation of the US, this administration, this president being a friend of democracy, of freedom, and of Ukraine. He's clearly none of these things. For all the inane questions and jibes as well about Zelensky not wearing a suit, it's timely to recall a famous image of Churchill visiting the White House in 1942 dressed in military fatigues. I doubt he would have had those same questions thrown at him. And to wrap this episode up, here is a quote by Anna from Ukraine. We may need your help to win, but we don't need your help to surrender. She addresses that, of course, to the US administration. Trump's deal was always about speed over strategy, convenience and self-aggrandizement over durability. And in the process, there's no mention of sustainable security, reparations, justice, or the return to sovereign borders, only an unseemly dash to rehabilitate the aggressor and get rich while the insubstantial peace deal holds. Zelensky may face tough days ahead, but this cold dose of reality may eventually be better for Ukraine, for Europe, and for the re-emergence of a democratic world order.